Hello and welcome to Shaka Extra Time, a show where Shaka gets to answer your questions. I'm the moderator today. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. In the studio with me is the Kabale Kid himself, Shaka Sali. Shaka, it's an honor always to be here with you, get to interact with you. How are you today? How are you feeling?
Well, I remain simple, easy, and as some of my fans have suggested, an awesome son of Africa.
Of the soil, right. Are you terrific?
Yes, I'm, in fact, not only terrific, but hugely terrific.
Hugely terrific. It's a pleasure to sit here with you today. So we have lots to discuss today. So many questions came in from you, the listeners. Shaka is here to answer them. Let's start with some of the leading stories happening on the continent, especially the story of the coronavirus. Senegal's health minister announced yesterday that the first case of coronavirus, which is in his country, which is the second in sub-Saharan Africa, was confirmed last week, was Nigeria. Do you believe that the continent is able to handle this crisis, this health crisis, if it finally is confirmed that we have more cases on the continent?
Unfortunately, Jackson, when you look at the data and you factor in the experience, unfortunately, most of the continent does not seem really to have the medical care capacity to do the right thing. You're talking about situations where people who are in positions of power to make those very serious decisions, they themselves sometimes have in fact done things that would suggest that they do not have, first and foremost, confidence in their own medical care systems.
Right. You're talking about the medical tourism that we see, people going outside of the country, of the continent for health care.
That's part of the reason why I'm saying that, because we read about people, for example, in positions of power, and we're talking, some of these people are in fact presidents. They actually go for medical checkup abroad or overseas.
Right. I've seen estimates where the continent loses billions, or I mean hundreds of millions of dollars in medical tourism. The rich, the 1%ers, the leaders, the politicians going outside to Europe, to North America, to for treatment, when they could have actually injected those funds into their healthcare systems. The World Health Organization's Africa director says that the continent's ability to tackle coronavirus has improved extremely. What do you think they mean by improving extremely? Have you seen any investment in the healthcare systems, as in East Africa, in Uganda, or your country, where you're from, that would give you confidence that this is something they would be able to tackle if it...
Maybe he's talking about the fact that for the first time Africa has introduced the Center for Disease Control based in Ethiopia, which I think is courtesy of the Chinese. I was looking at a joke that not only are the Chinese champions of everything, they are in fact almost becoming champions of manufacturing death, obviously talking about the corona.
Right.
I think that when you look across the continent, you have to think that this particular individual is probably doing or saying what he needs to say, because first and foremost, don't forget about how some of these individuals get those positions. It is political.
You're talking about the leaders of the World Health Organization and other these international agencies.
Yes, but I think that the man in charge of the World Health Organization, who happens to be a physician and a former Minister of Health of Ethiopia,
right,
he seems to be doing
Dr. Tewodros.
Yeah, he seems to be doing a very good job.
You have confidence that he's handling this the right way?
Yes, I've seen him making, speeches, addressing, press conferences, appealing to people.
But there's some people who say that, he has to make these considerations when he's making these appeals or press, statements when he's talking to the media. He's has some pressure from, powerful countries like China, and that he might not be, his hands are kind of tied behind in terms of what he can or cannot say.
I think from the little I have seen, he really seems to be, right on the money. Right on the money. I think he basically has been pretty much calling it like it is. And when you talk about Africa, I don't even know why we divide Africa in different groups. You talked about Senegal, and you said it is the second case in sub-Saharan Africa.
Correct.
The last time I checked, the disease, first of all, does not need a visa.
Does not segregate.
No, it does not. So when you talk about Egypt, really, you talk about Tunisia, you talk about Algeria, you're talking about Africa, So I think
first case, I think, was in Algeria, North Africa.
Yeah.
Shaka, we have lots to
Nigeria,
cover.
of course, is the most populous nation on the African continent.
Right. And
even though, of course, the affected individual happened to be Italian.
Correct.
And the one in Senegal happens to be French.
Right.
Yeah, but the fact of the matter is he pretty much interacts with everybody around there.
Right.
Yeah.
So this is hoping. Also, we should mention that there's a lot of misinformation taking place on the continent, especially on social media, about the extent of the coronavirus on the continent and how people are preparing themselves. And so, if you this is an appeal from Shaka Extra Time. If you have any questions about it, check out the WHO website. VOA also is doing a lot of coverage on the coronavirus. So please be careful, taking these bits of information that you get from your social media, especially WhatsApp, as medical facts or truth. Shaka, we have lots to cover, lots of ground to cover. Let's go to our first question from listener. His name is Jackson Freddy, definitely not me. His name is Mr. Freddy Jackson. He asks, what is the global standard definition of the word democracy? Is it the same as what we see being practiced in Africa right now? Is there basically essentially Western democracy and African democracy? Can you differentiate those two?
I wish there was such a thing really as, for example, African electricity, European electricity, Asian electricity. Thomas Edison, the man who is credited for inventing the electric bulb, he basically provided that ingenuity to humankind. I have not heard anybody complaining about electricity because it was in fact invented in a country known as the United States of America. I have not heard anybody complaining about using the telephone, because it was invented by Alexander Graham Bell in the United States of America. But I hear people complaining about democracy, which in fact is supposed to be the mother, sincerely, of everything you can think about in terms of making sure that
it's a bedrock of any society.
Precisely, because when you look at the tenets of democracy, they are essentially the fundamentals, sincerely, that reflect universal values. It is like somebody telling you that oxygen probably is Muzungu, or oxygen is Indian, or Singapore. All of us as human beings, in order for you to have life, to continue living,
survive, right?
You need to have unfettered access to this thing called oxygen. It doesn't matter which geographical part you happen to be in.
Right.
That's what you need.
Right.
The last time I checked, when you are hungry as a human being, it doesn't matter about your ideology, it doesn't matter about your race, your geography, whatever. You need
You feel
food.
hunger the same way.
You need food.
Right. And you're basically saying that democracy, whether you're in Africa, whether you're in Europe or in America, democracy should have the same meaning.
Precisely, because it talks about, for example, accountability. Accountability, Jackson, is accountability. Even in Africa, where we come from, in remote villages, there is that concept, that element, that practice of accountability in those communities. Fairness. justice, integrity, character, all those things. You don't need to come from a particular geographical location. You don't need to have some type of, color of a skin. It is like, I'm reminded of China, for example, again. I'm reminded of the man that took over after Chairman Mao Zedong died, Deng Xiaoping, when he decided that he was going to use capitalism to develop socialism by saying that he did not care about the color of the skin of the cat. What he cared about, rather, was whether, in fact, the cat can catch a mice. So I think that is, we all need some form
just to be clear
of democracy.
Right, absolutely, absolutely. So Shaka,
in fact, when we talk about democracy, maybe some people are threatened. We probably need to talk about how it is social, economic, political justice for all. So
then who are the people behind this argument that, Western democracy does not apply in Africa?
You will be surprised, Jackson, who those types of people are. In my last 27 years of working at the Voice of America, I have had privileges. I have had the honor, the opportunity to cover a lot of liberation struggles. I have had very intimate conversations with some of the leaders of some of these liberation struggles. I have never heard any of those people talking about how they are fighting to restore African democracy.
Right.
They are always talking about restoring this thing called democracy.
Democracy, right. You're talking about some of them who are currently leaders around the continent, because you know.
And I'm not going to have to worry about naming names, because I have talked about how I have covered those types of situations for the last 27 years.
But none of them told you that I'm fighting to implement African democracy in my country.
As a matter of fact, some of them, they even go beyond simply talking like that, become a little bit clearer by being generous enough to say that why do Europeans, for example, enjoy democracy?
Right.
We also need that type of democracy.
Right.
And so they talk about the restoration that they are actually fighting to restore democracy.
So what happens then?
Guess what?
What happens when they get to positions of power, when they're supposed to actually to implement that democracy, that those values that they've been fighting so hard for? Many of them lose their lives, others who are lucky enough to make it. What happens when they finally make it to the seat of power?
I wish I could say that they probably change. But as Michelle Obama once said, becoming a president, in her view, does not change you. It rather reveals you. Some of these individuals have to say some of those things because those are the things that people want to hear, need to hear. But when they get there, in those positions of power, they begin to reveal their selfishness. They begin to reveal those contradictions.
Is it possible that when you get to the seat of power, the challenges are immense? It's a whole different reality, and some of these ideals are unachievable in the sense that, you're starting from zero, from scratch, and you're building your way up?
They are achievable, but they are only achievable if you believe in them.
In the first place?
In the first place, because fundamentally they probably actually believe in becoming presidents, believe in occupying positions that give them unfettered access to power, whereby this power translates, for example, in living in some of the most gorgeous neighborhoods in their capitals.
Driving flashy cars.
Driving some of the most expensive cars, putting on some of the most beautiful, expensive fashion, attire, and all that kind of stuff.
And being able to go to Europe and America for treatment.
Yeah, and flying first class. And look, where did the founding, essentially father of Zimbabwe, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, where did he actually have his last breath? It was in Singapore, not in Harare. And can you imagine how many human beings in Zimbabwe probably do not even have penicillin? And who do you think was paying? It is essentially those poor
the taxpayers. Yes, yes.
So I think that some of these people, they have to talk about how democracy is an alien idea because they have to justify. But they have to justify why they hang on to power and privileges.
Right. If you're just joining us, this is Shaka Extra Time. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. Shaka Sali is right here in the studio answering your questions. We started with the question of coronavirus. Is the continent ready to tackle this health issue, health crisis that we see around the world? And then we went into democracy. The first question was the definition of democracy, whether there's African democracy, the concept of African democracy and Western democracy. The second question that is coming in from King Oke Soklo, I guess, is a follow-up to the first question, Shaka. He says, if you were to rate, which African countries do you think are most democratic and why? I mean, that's kind of a heavy question, but you've covered these nations for such a long time. Yes. You've seen the evolution of some of these societies over the years.
Oh, yeah.
What are some of the countries that give you, pause to, you feel encouraged when you see them and say, this is actually, they're on the right path?
If you look at Africa, in this particular case, I think I can agree that you can decide to look at it in terms of different regions where democracy has flourished and where it has yet to take roots, and where it is probably missing in action. For example, democracy, for the most part, has actually had some good days in West Africa. Even a country like Nigeria, especially the election of 2015, was free, fair, transparent, and verifiable and credible.
When Goodluck Jonathan, I believe, handed over to Mr. Buhari. So
consider defeat with grace.
Right.
You have had Ghana, for example, where you have been having every after 4 years, you have actually been having elections that have been credible, whereby in some cases an incumbent president has actually lost an election. Like the last time when John Dramani Mahama lost an election, which was won by Nana Akufo-Addo, who belonged to a different party, considered a defeat with grace and stepped aside. And the other gentleman, Nana Akufo-Addo, is in power. You have situations like in Benin.
Let me keep you. Actually, let's go to Benin because I want to bring you back to Ghana, because Ghana, as you covered it, has had a long journey from the days of flight lieutenant, as you like to say, retired, but certainly not tired. Right, during the man that you quite personally.
Yeah.
They have been on this journey for quite a while. Would you say that maybe for every country they'll have to go through that process, a Jerry Rawlings period, for them to lay groundwork for the kind of democracy we see flourishing right now in Ghana?
We shouldn't really have to go through that kind of journey, but in some cases, sometimes you have to. But let's face it, they have done a very good job in Ghana, and I think that one could quite possibly even look at them as the beacon of hope for African democracy in their region. And then you go to Southern Africa. You look at South Africa, for example. I mean, you have had 2 presidents, incumbent presidents, who were in fact recalled by their own political parties. I'm talking about the African National Congress, recalling, for example, Mshorozi, Jacob Zuma, who was replaced by Cyril Ramaphosa. And much earlier, ironically, it was a man called Jacob Zuma who was leading the charge against another president, Thabo
Mbeki, yes.
Yeah, so really, there is a democracy there. There's no question that you are having an independent, for example, judiciary. You're having an independent legislature, and you're having an independent executive. You do not have an executive in South Africa or in Ghana, in those countries that have proven themselves really to be democratic, whereby the two branches of government, the judiciary and the legislature, are simply subsidiaries
of the executive. Right, right.
Yeah,
so would you say a good test for democracy is if presidents are, leave power, if there is peaceful transition of power like we've seen in Ghana,
yes,
like in South Africa?
Yes.
Would you say that is the litmus test for good, I guess, democratic values of a country? If a president is in power and he's voted out and he's able to leave without any, crisis?
As a matter of fact, Jackson, you are right. But one could also say that they have only one responsibility, really. When they win an election and they are actually invited to take the oath, and if they are Christians, they hold the Bible, and sometimes with the help of the First Lady and all that kind of stuff. Guess what? They actually talk about how they are going to defend, to preserve, and protect yes, the Constitution.
Right, right.
But they should not be in the business, for example, of changing those very constitutions so that they can actually become what I would characterize as personal political manifestos.
Interesting, interesting.
Because those constitutions do not belong to them. They belong to the people.
Absolutely.
But the problem is you have the dearth or the lack of what I would call civic education, to such an extent that the ordinary citizen, for the most part, does not know his or her relationship between himself or herself and this thing called the government or the state.
The state,
because
yes,
at the end of the day, it is the people who have to be socially and politically conscious, aware of their power to the extent that they can in fact assert it and demand certain standards from the people who are supposed to be their employees. Meaning a president is not the boss.
He's an employee.
He's an employee and he's supposed to be accountable to the people who elect him or her to get into that position.
Shaka,
the Chief Justice, and you name it.
Right, absolutely. And we can talk democracy all day, Shaka, with you, and hopefully we'll have another opportunity to talk to further this conversation. But I want to put in some questions, some personal questions that came in from listeners about your life, about you as a person.
Yes.
One question says, if you were not the host of Straight Talk Africa here on The Voice of America,
yes,
who would you like to be, or what would you like to be?
It is very interesting, a very good question, because let's face it, I was not born as a host of Straight Talk Africa.
You were not born in Studio 47.
And as a matter of fact, we started with Studio 18.
Yeah, okay.
And I can also say there was no Straight Talk Africa when I joined The Voice of America in 1992. I actually demanded that program specifically from the Voice of America director who was called Sunday Anga in 1999. And it started 2000. And we are about to celebrate the 20 years of that very important
Such a milestone.
platform.
Such a milestone,
But you know what? First of all, romantically, I wouldn't mind being, for example, Lance Spearman, the moral equivalent of James Bond.
Right, the man who inspired your love for the hat.
Yes,
if you guys have been watching Shaka Extra Time when I hosted it, Shaka did talk about Lance Spearman.
Yeah,
yes.
But then again, I was also inspired largely by a Ugandan journalist who used to drive a blue Citroen called Jore Joe Chiwanuka.
Yes.
He used to have a white Nile. He used to have a nightclub in White Nile which I used to patronize sometimes when I was in the School of Paratroopers in Rubiri. And he also was a publisher of a Uganda daily newspaper called Buganda Post, which my father, John Wilson Mushakamba, used to religiously subscribe to. In my particular case, because I admired Drum Magazine, which was like my Bible, which was then published in Soweto, South Africa.
And that's where you saw Lance Spearman,
yes.
right?
Well, Lance Spearman came up, in fact, Lance Spearman itself, that magazine or whatever, was actually being published by the Drum publishers.
The same publishers,
yeah,
yes.
So I could have probably become a publisher of a weekly magazine, just like one of my heroes, really, Hilary Ngweno in Kenya, used to have weekly review, or I could have had a monthly magazine, and also have a nightclub where people come and get
enjoy
down and be happy.
Yes. That's an exclusive. If you're just joining us, this is Shaka Extra Time. We're coming to the end of our show today. Shaka, it's always a joy to sit with you. But before we leave you, or before we leave our audience, we want to know what is happening on Straight Talk Africa tomorrow, so people can tune in.
You know, we are going to talk about the country that last got its political independence, the youngest nation in the world in 2011, the Republic of South Sudan. It just has put together a transitional government of national unity, and we are going to be looking at its viability tomorrow.
Do you believe, do you have confidence that the peace process is going to hold?
You know, I am not a prophet. I have to be the type of person that is guided by facts, really. I think we'll find out tomorrow. I think that there is hope. You hope that it is going to happen, but at the same time, you also make sure that you plan for what could probably, happen.
Eventualities.
You plan for the worst while hoping for the best.
For the best, absolutely. Yeah. And with that, we come to the end of our show today, Shaka Extra Time. Shaka, I enjoyed this.
It was a pleasure.
Yes, absolutely. Maybe we should do the Corona shake.
Thank you.
And thanks to you, all our listeners, or our viewers who tune in today in Shaka Extra Time. My name is Jackson Vunganyi. You can follow me at Upfront Africa. That's my Twitter handle, my Instagram. You can also check out my show every Wednesday on voanews.com. Shaka, have a good show tomorrow, and hopefully we'll be back here next Tuesday.
Thank you very much, and yes. I can't wait for next Tuesday again.